Now we are live. Hey guys, I just want to remind you all that thanks for coming, and I want to remind you all that this is the season for ghosting, and it doesn't just happen on Tinder. Apparently, this is something that we're hearing about as a trend, if you will, that some employees actually don't really do very much, or some engineers don't really do very much. This is a little controversial. And what we'll also hear this season is that it's also the season when bonuses are being figured out, promotions, and maybe layoffs. We'll get to all of that. All right. But first, this is episode 66 of This Week in MeteorJS. A weekly newscast of the MeteorJS Dispatches podcast. My name is Lim Ghaffar, streaming live from New York City. And with me today.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jan Dvorak, aka Storyteller CZ, streaming to you live from Sendai.
Yes, and with you also is Jan Küster from Germany, streaming to you live with a new camera today.
Yay. We're trying different things, yeah. And with that, we're going to get straight to the news. Küster, what do you got for us?
Yeah, so before we go into productivity, let's first talk about one of the new productivity killers, because there is this new product liability directive in the EU, which is basically a good thing when you're a customer, that those who build a product have to be held liable for that product, and they have to provide you certain guarantees for that product. But, and here's the thing, the latest work on that directive, which was published in September this year, so it started much earlier, but the latest version clarifies that software must be considered a product in the scope of that directive, and that has crazy implications. On the one hand, you will have very interesting law court cases in the future about liability on things like software updates and security issues, because this directive also considers that the lack of software updates under the manufacturer's control, as well as the failure to address security vulnerabilities, will be held accountable. And it's not figured out yet how far this will be a part of the final legislation in every country, but this is coming from the EU, so this will affect everyone inside the EU and even other manufacturers and software developer companies and so on who will participate in the EU. It also alleviates the burden of proof for victims, which is also, again, it's a good thing from consumer side. But again, when you're a developer, especially when you're a small developer, this could get you in much faster in trouble than you might think. And one thing that we should consider still positive, it's not affecting open source or non-commercial software. So it will not destroy open source, but we will keep an eye on that. We will watch this closely, how this develops, and we'll cover that definitely in the future, because this may affect many of us.
Hey, Jan, does this affect like the US, anybody that has a nexus to Europeans that might use their software?
That's the question. I'm neither a lawyer nor am I that deep in the business, but I know that many US companies have a sub company in Ireland. Ireland is very famous for international companies to reside or make business in the EU. And if they want to make business in the EU, then they have to follow the terms of the EU. At least that's the thinking of the EU, even if we're in a globalized economy. And so let's see how that works out. I think this will go that far. There will be definitely prime cases in the European Supreme Court that will talk about this. This will not be a light thing, in my opinion.
Yeah, it very much reminds me of GDPR, both in scope and how it's being implemented. And when GDPR first came out, I went to official, state workshops, and the lawyer just outright told us, like, we have no freaking clue, really, how this is going to work, because it assumes we are kind of waiting for the case law to see the first courts. So that has kind of the similar thing. I have already through my current work with Czech state, I have already requested some clarifications, because if this comes through as it's currently written, or kind of taking the worst case scenario, then doing business in EU is an issue, because then you can say, okay, if somebody does a DDoS attack and one of my clients cannot access our website for a little bit,
or loses money.
Or whatever happens, or they for example, they cannot access our website, and then they claim, okay, I've lost money because of that. They can sue me, and I am responsible.
It sounds like
that's an issue.
It sounds like this is creating good employment opportunities
especially for Cloudflare.
Yeah, that's among things. But speaking of avoiding EU and everything, that's becoming a reality. Recently, OpenAI released Sora for a video generator for the world, except the EU and maybe a few other countries, but primarily EU. So EU is becoming increasingly, let's just call it a museum or a Disneyland for Japanese side. That's literally how many Japanese kind of see when I kind of show them pictures of from Prague and other places. It's like, oh, it's like a Disneyland. So I think with all these GDPR and the recent things, and given also the overwhelming trends in the EU, this is not going to get better, at least as far as I can see. So I think EU developers have to kind of prepare themselves that they will be out of the loop on many new technologies.
Wow, that's that doesn't sound positive at all. I hope that the assessment or the analysis is not as bleak when we face the reality. But speaking of facing reality, I don't know if you guys heard about this one. This is a little disturbing. As a matter of fact, the Primogen did a little a bit on it. It's there's this company in India called Yes Madam. I think they should call themselves No Madam going forward. And, they sent out a survey. They noticed that they were getting some very stressed responses from stress behavior from their team members, and they sent out a survey asking about stress and so on, and how they felt about it. And then when their employees responded to let their employer know how much stress they were facing, they took a rather unusual turn, sort of like the thing that managers kind of like think in their head but never do. They did. They fired them all. As a matter of fact, I want to just read you the email that they all received. It says, "Dear team, recently we conducted a survey to understand your feelings about stress at work. Many of you shared your concerns, which we deeply value and respect. As a company committed to fostering a healthy and supportive work environment," by the way, they mention how supportive they are, we have carefully considered the feedback. To ensure that no one remains stressed at work, we have made the very difficult decision to part ways with employees who indicated significant stress. This decision is effective immediately, and impacted employees will receive further details separately. Thank you for your contributions. Best regards, Yes Madam. And I gotta say, if I were working at this place, I don't think I'd respond to any future surveys in an honest and forthright manner. As a matter of fact, I think one of the things that Prabhajit mentioned was that you really do have to be careful about, what you share with HR, because it's not always going to be. I'm paraphrasing. It's not always going to be in your best interest. But have you ever heard of something like this? Did you hear about the story?
I heard about
Yes.
it.
Yeah. So in the article here from Inc., it says, what will happen if you fire people after you ask them to share their feelings? Now, this is from an American perspective. Sending out employment engagement surveys can be a good thing, but when you react negatively, here's what happens. The company will terminate the most stressed employees. The remaining employees will have to pick up the work. The remaining employees' stress levels will increase, right? All employees will know that expressing any sort of dissatisfaction will result in punishment, and the level of toxicity will increase. Nobody will ever give an honest answer on an employee engagement survey again. So let me turn that back.
I actually wonder if that's a strategy to make the rest of them leave. So we have data on them, they need to leave, and then the rest is leaving by their own, so we don't need to file bankruptcy and can continue to work with 3 people. This is actually in Germany. There was the what's the name? The unspoken truth that many companies, especially the bigger ones, tended to use this get back from home office into office in order to make people leave on their own, because when you leave on your own, you don't get any compensation, payment, and it's also it's not an official layoff.
I think these are strategies that really big companies can use because they have enough employees for coverage. I don't get the impression, I might be wrong, that Yes Madam is one of those. I just think that this is just, really, really bad. Hang on a second. We've got something from Simon here in Africa. You say, if you try to be too much intelligent, you end up greeting the goat on the street. Oh, this is about the European thing. Okay.
Yeah.
And we have another user, Elon Musk, who says that this is very disturbing. Elon, if you're related to Elon, you're probably used to this. So it's,
I think this entire thing goes back. We've kind of covered it previously. I think both on this channel on I think we had like a discussion, Alan, or maybe it was just me. I think that the title was "Bring Yourself Fully to Work."
Yep.
And that just goes there's also kind of big.
That was on your channel.
Yes, yeah. And that there's I'll try to very quickly. There's also big difference of kind of approaching work, especially like difference in American, say the rest of the world, where in America there's a lot of this for language. Oh, we are a family and everything.
Yeah.
But the reality everywhere else is that that's just not the case, especially the bigger the company. And I think the big takeout from this is, especially if it's like if it's like a company of size where you actually have HR department, HR is not your friend. They are there, let's say, as the policeman for the company and for kind of the boss to take care of all the paperwork, and usually also means that so it's the boss coming, hire this guy, get it sorted, or later on boss coming and saying fire this guy, and so some other people also going in. But I think that's a big takeaway.
Yeah, you're quite right about that. That HR, people have to remember that HR is a convenience that you get at the office to help move things along, but at the end of the day, they work for the company and they represent the company's interests, not yours. Sometimes they intersect, right? That's what you hope for, but you've got to be mindful of the fact that HR is there for the company, not for you. The whole feel about this is that maybe I don't know, especially the way it's signed. Best regards, Yes Madam. I don't know if this is the actual signature on the email. Because I think I've seen another version of this, which was in Reddit, where I believe it had the name of a person, but this might be a fever dream for me, and I might have been thinking that this is actually the case, but it might not be. In any case, yes, as Olan Musk said, this is very disturbing. It is not, I think, indicative of good management. And we'll get further into things like this a little later down when we get into our main discussion. But for now, let's move on to other bits of news.
Yeah, so we covered microservices already from this technical perspective, especially from the Meteor perspective, but sometimes it's just necessary to step back a little bit from this concrete technology use case and implementation thing back to this more conceptual overview thing. And we thought that would be a very good composition together with what we provide on the technical perspective, here a conceptual overview perspective, when to choose which. So this is a nice general overview article. Plus, there is an interesting, more opinionated discussion at the end of it. So if you're interested in these things, monolithic, microservices, when to choose which, and what happens at which, then this is something you should check out. And then later on, come back to our channel and watch the 101 video from our side where we create a little microservice with Meteor.
All right. Back to our favorite monolith.
Your microphone went out.
Mine?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. So basically what I wanted to say is, I don't know what was the last part, but I say, it would be a good approach if it's new to you or you're interested in this whole thing, monolithic versus microservices, and you want to get an introduction, an overview, when to choose which, then you can read this article, get some also opinions on the bottom, and then come back to our channel and watch our introduction to microservices with Meteor, and then start your own microservices journey.
Okay.
I don't know.
Off to our favorite monolith.
Yeah.
So I have two news for you guys from the Meteor community packages. First of all, very much anticipated, the Redis uplog version 3 has been released. This is a Meteor 3 compatibility and only Meteor 3 release. So if you need that, then it's already, and I'm looking for more patches and improvements, so hopefully we can get that out so that we can keep improving this service. And next we have check npm version 2.1, which has a major update to Semver and package inside it to fix some security issue, which hopefully did not affect us, but it's always better to be on a good side. And of course, some other additional work I did around is to make sure that we are up to date with all the GitHub actions and other dependencies. And with that, we move off to our featured topics.
Well, before that, first of all, guys, we've got two things to ask of you. If you like the work that we're doing and you're here, hit the like button. It helps the algorithm make sure that this program gets discovered. Excuse me. And also, boy, I'm going through voice changes now. Must be puberty again. But also, if you are one of those people, and we have many, more than half of our viewers are not subscribers to our channel, please, please, please subscribe to the channel. We're trying to get to 350. Well, we're trying to get to 325. We had a couple reversals. We'd like to get there at the end of this week if possible. So if you're one of those that can help us get to 320, I believe we're at 318 now. I'm sorry, not 320, 325. I keep on throwing out different numbers. Help us do that. By the end of December, I'd like to get to 350. And if you can make sure that getting in, what am I saying? If you can just hit that subscribe button, that'll help us. Thanks a lot. And with that, let's head on over to that feature topic. What are we covering today?
Ghosts. It's a bit late for Halloween.
Yeah. We're talking about developer productivity metrics, how do you evaluate developer contribution? And we've seen this topic being brought forward today from a bunch of different angles. In some cases, people are talking about ghost employees, ghost engineers, people that are, you've heard of quiet quitting, and that's been a talk or a topic that's been on the table for the whole year, about people that just kind of like stop working when they don't like their job and not do that. Well, now there's a really sketchy, as our friends at the other channel, Fireship, calls it, a sketchy Stanford study that says 9.5% of all software engineers actually don't do anything. And there was an article from Lisa Bonos in the Washington Post that asks, are ghost engineers real? Seeking Silicon Valley's least productive coders. And also in the news was a piece from Jason Keebler, entitled, from the 404 Media, entitled, "Are Overemployed Ghost Engineers Making Six Figures to Do Nothing?" So in many cases, this idea of it's based on this study that came out of Stanford that says we have data on the performance of 50,000 engineers from hundreds of companies. 9.5% of software engineers do virtually nothing, and they call them ghost engineers. On top of that, we also have, kind of like filling in the void here, Amazon making a claim that developers spend only 1 hour a day on actual work coding. Amazon says developers spend just 1 hour a day. This is a piece that was brought into view by Sydney Lake from Fortune. And it's brief, but it has a really startling mention from an official AWS blog post. It says, and I'll quote, "Developers spend the majority of their time on, quotation, tedious, undifferentiated tasks such as learning code bases, writing, reviewing documentation, testing, managing deployments, troubleshooting issues, or finding and fixing vulnerabilities." So sort of the context of, like, if you say that coding and writing code is the content, this concept between context and content. Content is the thing that you do that gets you what you need, right? It's your skill or your focus, and context is all the other stuff that you need to do in order to make that happen. It's claiming that developers spend a huge amount of time on this. By the way, I've heard the same thing said about data scientists and data science. For them, I think this is a pitch for their AI, how their AI services can offload those context tasks.
Yeah.
So
Alan, I have to ask you one thing. Have you read the study actually about that? Or let me ask differently. Do you think the authors of these articles have read the original study? Because you already said it's a little bit sketchy, that study. And the question here is, how did they actually measure this? How did they come up with these numbers? Because it sounds so crazy. Nearly 10% are doing nothing. And I personally would wonder, if they have this huge amount of data, how do they come up to this conclusion from a qualitative thing, writing code, being performant in writing code, to this quantitative thing, like so many percent doing nothing?
So, the researcher in one of the articles is a fellow by the name of Igor Denisov Blanche, and said that he has a relationship with a bunch of tech companies that gave him access to their private GitHub repositories that he then went over. And he has been running an algorithm of his own, which is not disclosed, against these code bases to do an automatic code review. And basically, the analysis says that they don't do much of anything. And but my understanding is that the algorithm is described in the paper that he has put out, and I think you've pointed out, by the way, that it's a preview, right? It's not a published review paper. It's a preprint. right?
And if it would be peer reviewed, there would be someone who asks them, like, where is your algorithm? I cannot review a paper with some outcome if I don't know the exact algorithm on how this is determined, because that's the principle of a scientific publication review, that there's someone want to publish a work about a circumstance driving to a conclusion that I, as a reviewer, has to understand, because it needs to be valid. So I'm measuring what I want to measure, and it needs to be reproducible. So if I reproduce your procedure, I need to come to the same conclusion. And that's a problem when the algorithm is disclosed. I cannot reproduce it. So this is would be an inherent flaw. And I don't know the backgrounds of that. Maybe they have published the algorithm to those journals where they want to publish it for the reviewers, but not to the public. That would be a different thing. But I think here is a different flaw in that study, and that is writing code only the part of the engineering productivity? Because as you said before, in Amazon, they only write 1 hour code. So the rest is not productive? I doubt that, because then Amazon would lay all them off.
Right. So let me just answer a couple of things here. First of all, in section 2 of the paper, they do go through the algorithm model, and they mention that if you're a researcher and you're interested, they have an API that they would give you access to, so that you could then, validate this yourself. But they say that what they're trying to answer is what a human would answer. Questions like, how difficult is the problem that the commit solves? How many hours would you take to normally write code that for this kind of commit, assuming that you could fully focus on the task? Which, by the way, assuming could fully focus, right, is key here. How well structured is the source code relative to previous commits, and broken into quartiles within that list, and how maintainable is this commit? So they're looking at, or they're trying to evaluate code quality with this. They use a random forest model in order to, as part of the model that is being used. So it's an AI model that they're trying to use, or a deep learning model, if you want to call it that, and they give an email address that you can send your request to get access to this API to then validate it. But they mention a number of different metrics that they're looking for in terms of code structure, code quality, implementation details, architectural elements that their analysis is trying to prove. I think you're absolutely right, by the way, that just looking at this from this point of view doesn't take into account the fact that if you're on large teams, a lot of your time might be spent in meetings, or if you are tasked with programming, but at the same time running a group, right, or running projects, the amount of time that you actually spend writing code might be minimized, because you have all these other responsibilities. So I think, using this information by itself in isolation to make a determination as to somebody is a ghost employee or a ghost engineer, I think is really a problem. So I don't know. That's my feeling, about this. Yeah, it's, are we addressing this? Is this in a sense? My worry is that when managers see this, when people that are not really technical or haven't really been in the trenches look at this, or just bad managers that are looking for an excuse, sort of like confirmation bias, because they're not seeing things move along very quickly. This becomes just this tool to say, oh, wait a minute, our projects aren't moving that fast, instead of looking at all the other things that contribute to project slack, right? As we said, things like, by the way, is there an undue amount of overhead for getting your projects moving along? Those might be responsible for taking your engineers away from actually doing focused work.
I just want to throw in one thing. I know, Jan, you want to say something. I just don't want to forget it. there's also one thing in this that we didn't mention, and this is coming up in the articles. There's also the note that a large proportion of these so-called ghost engineers are working at home office. Oh my God, whoever wants to hear that, to get them all back to office? And I tell you what, it might be even true, because once I started to get in home office, I had doubled the amount of meetings I have, because it's much easier to get people into a Zoom or a video call meeting than get them into a room together. So my meeting amount increased, but that was not on my decision. That was not on me. So the question here is, how do we take these things into account? Sorry, Jan.
Yes, I have 3 things, and for Amazon, actually, two things. I remember it's been years back, an article pretty much about kind of hellish meetings, and I would say, well, hellish meetings, which is also a result of insane focus on criticism inside of Amazon. So I think there's also with Amazon a lot of other, let's say, aspects impacting that just 1 hour per day of actual coding. If you are constantly worried that people will actually yell at you, so you do a lot of ask covering and other things to prevent that. So that was that thing we already mentioned, and I kind of have it because I just started kind of watching the GitCon that was earlier this week, and the keynote was from AWS, I think one of the head of product or something like that, and of course it was all about AWS Q, which is their new AI thing that will help you program all the tedious things, will program for you, so you can increase your productivity and focus on other things, which kind of I think goes into it, because for me as a programmer, I don't want AI to program for me, because for the most part it's still shit. Sorry for my language. I want AI to take care of all the other things that is slowing me down, which I'm not expert in, which is dealing with people, meetings, emails, all that stuff. So that plays a big part of that. Another part also kind of maybe more to the methodology to kind of consider is what I have in one of my company. I'm like kind of at the point of yelling at my other developers, because I tell them, at the end of every day, I want you to commit your work so I can see, what you're doing, how you're progressing, and maybe I can reach out. The problem is that, right now, one of my developers, he always force pushes. So I cannot see that, he's working each day and how he's approaching it. So that leaves me, makes it difficult for me to help him or kind of see where he is going out among other problems.
Jan,
So that's an issue there.
Have you thought about sending out a survey about how stressed they are?
That would be a thing.
So there's a lot of other additional considerations. So that's why always taking these studies with a lot of grain of salt and other things Jan mentioned.
Yeah, I gotta say, I'm going back a little bit here. I don't know if you guys remember this fellow, Joel Spousky. Joel is, founder of Fog Creek Software. He his company created Trello, Stack Overflow, which I think all of us have used at one time or another. I got introduced to him through a product called FogBugs. It was a bug tracking software that we used at SpeedCycle, where eventually it became a little more than bug tracking. We also use it for project management, and then it was kind of sold that way. And Joel's famous for writing this blog called Joel on Software, and I think he wrote this for I think over 10 years, and it fell off I think around 2020, 2022, probably during when COVID came around. But going back and rereading some, like a lot of these things that I see here, I've seen again and again. My first entry in software in the 1990s there was always a question like, how do we measure developer productivity? Do we do it in lines of code? Do we do it in functions that are written? Like, what do we do about this? How do we make this predictable, and how do we figure out whether or not we just have dead weight on our hands? And reading Amnesia is like reading these performance focused articles today that we talked about. And in the article on Amnesia, he mentions a number of different things. He's really talking about like a decision that he made, and then something that came back to him later on where he thought like, why are you asking me this? The obvious answer is something else. And then when he looked back on a video, he saw that he had actually like given the opposite answer at one point. But the thing that he points out here is what you measure, what measure you focus on becomes what employees learn to maximize. Yeah. And so that's the thing that we always have to remember here. And then in another article that he had written, the emails you'll get, I read that way back in the day, and it's worth reading. So let me just read it because it's not a very long one, but it does have a bit here that it's I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it's basically an article that went on a little bit of a rant about management consultants and the fact that they often like create problems. They claim that they can help you, and then they'll go to your competitors. They'll tell their help. Once you've had your improvement, they'll go to their competitors and tell them something else so that they can continue selling things. But the point that, let me see if I can find it here. Where is this bit here that, if I can remember what it is, it says, okay, consulting company comes in, gets all the programmers in a room, tells them all about function points and stuff and how productivity is really important. Programmers remember that scene from Office Space where Bob and Bob, the consultants, recommend all the people get fired. Programmers start writing a heck of a lot more function points. For example, you could triple the number of function points in your code simply by round tripping everything through an XML file. Big waste of time, prone to bugs, does nothing, but for each file you touch adds a function point. Woot, right? And that goes back again to this notion that if you start saying, well, these are the things that count, and we're going back now to that Stanford company, the Stanford study, that on the number of commits and the quality of commits, right? It's how do you determine that if somebody commits 100,000 lines of code and you say, well, okay, they're not a Ghost developer, they're committing 100 lines of code, and by the way, it's pretty good, it fits the middle of the bell curve. How do you know that the guy that wrote the 500 lines of code, that his code isn't vastly superior in quality, and the amount of effort and time it took to kind of figure out algorithmically how to write that code in 500 lines of code so that you don't use up stack space, you don't use up a huge amount of compute time, you're minimizing big O, right? How do you account for that? If you say AI is going to do it, I don't believe that. I don't buy it. And that is something I think that we have to be mindful of. There's one last piece that he did on Fog Creek compensation, where Joel points out the difficulties in figuring out how to evaluate people. He writes, everybody is different, and their skills and aptitudes may show up in different ways. One excellent contributor may write a ton of code. Another strength might be in getting the teams to gel and work together. It's impossible to use hard and fast metrics to decide where someone fits in, and these kinds of metrics tend to accidentally incentivize the wrong things. Instead, we have a bunch of heuristics. He's talking about how they do things at Fog Creek. We have a bunch of heuristics which tend to provide an accumulation of evidence that a given engineer belongs in a given category. When we're done applying them, we look at some of the other people in the category to determine if we got the right result. Nothing is carved in stone, except the principle that within each group, people should be true peers. So it's really more than just looking at a number or looking at some, result from an analysis and then saying, hey, this person's dead weight. There is a lot of other things that come into managing. And I think this really speaks to, the effort that people need to make in order to properly manage talent.
Before we move into the next one, can you please remain on that compensation thing? There was a very important word here that has been covered, and that is heuristics.
Yep.
And heuristics, maybe some of you might know that heuristics, in contrast to metrics, are a qualitative factor because they are not 100% fitting the real world, but they're like a category of real world traits or real world real world circumstances and so on. And that's an interesting thing, because when you do qualitative research, for example, usability research, there is also, you can do some of the metrics, but not everything is always can be applied in metrics. And sometimes you need heuristics to do an evaluation of things. And this is where we get closer to a realistic view of how did your team perform? How did our software project perform? Yep. Because it's actually a qualitative question. How did we perform? We're not machines. We can't say, the only thing we can say we performed with these features in this time and these bugs occurred. Okay, that's a factual thing. But it doesn't say anything about how we as humans performed in that project, because there are way too many factors in here. So going into that direction of heuristics is actually what we want to do.
Yeah, it's and the thing with the heuristic mention that he puts in here is really to point out that the data doesn't tell the whole story, right?
Yeah.
Because there are other things that may come into play. And so really, managing teams is hard work. And it's very easy to say, let me just take a look at a bunch of numbers and then I'll figure out who I'm going to get rid of. But it might not be doing your team justice, and it might not be the right way of doing this. As a matter of fact, let me take away the word might. It's not the right way. You have to take into account a plurality of things. And the metrics guide you. But it's really, at the end of the day, it's a human judgment that you need to apply, and obviating it to a model, I don't think is going to be the right way to do things. But that's my opinion. I mean, what's your thoughts on this? Should we be relying on models and AI to make management decisions for us and figure out who stays and who's worthy and who's not?
No, from the simple reason that AI cannot take responsibility. Just from that, AI can be, as a advisor, but at the end of the day, it has to be a human, because human can take responsibility for actions. And
but
that then adds another level there.
The question is if we can at least make a comparison over time, how the AI would have decided, for example, when employees respond that they're stressed out.
Yeah, well, that's like another thing. AI doesn't care.
No. Yeah. In a positive and a negative way, basically.
Yeah, so if we go to the say the original company that's in the letter, that was actually a very much, the action there was what AI would do. Okay, these people are a problem. They themselves report that they are not well, so get rid of it. And I kind of want to finish this up before we move to more of Meteor specifically related in this aspect. Is there's another study from Activestate from 2019 that found that instead of increasing flexibility and decreasing response time, developers are seemingly being pulled in multiple directions. Developer report that design, architecture, meeting, testing, and bug hunting are the most common distractions.
Yeah.
So there's also like another thing here, just like even in this statement, is that there is this other focus that developers should, primarily be focused on, new features, but maintenance, I would say, which is at the end of the day probably once you actually release your product, the biggest part of things.
Sure.
Bug fixing and DevOps, all those things will eventually take most of the time. So that's like another thing. Part of this article also is that they are, you could say, in a bit pushing that you need to have a QA services for your company, all that stuff. So that's their angle there as well.
Yeah.
But I think it primarily underlines that, especially as the company grows, as you become, for example, more senior developer and kind of start maybe transitioning to leadership, there is more stuff that comes that pulls you on it, and kind of as your, say, expertise and as grows and as you see more, the more it's going to take to produce the code that's where you spend not actually, or that's the time you spend crafting is not going to end up in the number of lines of code that you produce. Was it 2 years back, I spoke with one of our friends, and he said that he has been having issue with promotion, because even though he has been focusing on the high you could say impact tasks that he got assigned, and but at the end of the day, the change that he made have just been a few lines of code. So that's a problem. How do you put that into performance review? It's something I'm also, for example, struggling with my dealings with the state, because some of the say metrics, that's not something that you can easily put onto a report sheet, or put it in a way that non-technical person would understand it. The problem is, if I try to describe it in a way that would make sense, then the non-technical person who doesn't know about industry is not going to understand it, and is going to not approve my report, which has actually happened. So that's all those things come in.
Yeah, there are a couple of things I just want to add 30 seconds, and then we're going to move on to the other part here, which is that one of the things this doesn't capture, and we don't know about, is the actual practices at these different firms whose repos have been scraped, right? So, we had a problem at one of the companies I worked at when I was an engineering manager, where developers, finally came out after a year or so and said, listen, we're not really getting very much work done, and it's not really our fault. We just don't get into the zone because we're constantly being pulled apart here. And so we ended up, instituting I think it was like a Code Wednesday. It's like a day where there were no meetings. It was a no meeting day where developers could sit at their desk and just work. And I think, if you were going to say, look, if you have that kind of a situation at your firm, and then what we're going to look at code contributions during that one day when everybody's supposed to have 100% focus, maybe you have something that you can work with. But because of all these other things that come into play, I don't know how good the quality of the metrics are that you're bringing up here. So anyway, I think this is a topic that is going to be argued about. It's going to be talked about for a while. I don't know that we're going to have a clear answer, but certainly I think if you have some suggestions as to how your organizations or teams could, be productive and get satisfaction from the team, then I would encourage you to share that too. And let's move on now. I think, Kuster, is this you?
Sorry, I was just about writing ChatGPT a question about if it with this. I will get back to that in the end about this laying off stressed employees or helping them. Let's see what it will answer. But in that case, let's take a look at the MeteorJS repository commit graph. So this is also a little bit part of understanding Meteor, because that goes into the Meteor history, and you know who is sponsoring our Understanding Meteor segment. Yep. This is actually Galaxy, the #1 hosting platform for your Meteor applications, and ready to scale when you're ready. SSL certificates, push to deploy, everything out of the box, including MongoDB hosting. So get your $60 credits at our link that we offered there with the dispatches 60 coupon code. Okay, let's take a look in the Meteor repository commit graph. So, you know, Meteor exists since late 2011, beginning 2012. And this commit graph shows you there, that's the commit graph over time from the beginning until today. And as you can see, there was a time when Meteor was really hitting off, like in late 2014 until, let's say, 2017. That was the prime phase of Meteor, if we just consider commits here. And then it looks like, oh my God, and then there's just nothing. It's nearly dead. And we talked about that thing of, yeah, there's something is dead and so on, and in true, in fact, it's not. But what are these commits in nature? So can we say, okay, there was a very productive time between 2014 and 2016, and then in 2020 there was no productivity? We can't really tell anything about that, because this is just a metric on its own. It doesn't say anything about the content. And I was looking at the pull requests, and I got 3 pull requests out that I want to show you that have a big impact on the Meteor system, but that have just very few lines of code and just very few commits. By the way, they were all 3 from
Zothern.
They were all opened from Zothern, I think. Yes. They were all opened by Zothern, and basically these are all mostly performance improvements. And if you look into these commits, you can just look into these commits using the hash number there on the GitHub repository. You will see that the text on the description about what this does is much bigger than the commit itself, and the code that has changed. Because there was, and this is what you don't see, there was research involved before these commits. There was time invested. How does it work? How is it problematic? How the algorithm is to be analyzed? What are my alternatives? And then they have to be tried out. So what you see is the result of all the work that was done before in, I would say, in a atomic way. Okay, so this is the atomic result of all the work that has done before, and this is put into this commit. And I wonder if this is even comparable to another commit of that same size and that same frequency, where all this prior work is just not taken into account. So as you can see, just from these commits, or from this work, so we didn't put the code in there. I just wanted to show you this as an example. There are small changes with big impact. And then, and these were at that time, so they are 2020 and 2022. If you get back one slide prior, Jan, then we can see, if we get back one slide, this is the time which looks like the least performant phase. But that's actually not true, because this has nothing to do with performance in general, you know. And these were very crucial improvements on Meteor, on Meteor's performance at least. So I would also argue that was a tremendous, a great developer or software engineering performance by Zothern with these 3 commits. And if we would go by this metric of how many commits you do and something like this, I don't know if that would be really productive. So the biggest work might be done outside of them. And if you go one slide further, please, Jan, I don't say that this commit is worse or something like this. I just want to say you don't see the files change now. But if you open, if you enter the hash number in the Meteor repository on GitHub, you will see there are 3 files changed, but there's lots of code there has been added because this is a new feature. And it looks like, so you can't compare these new feature to a performance improvement or a bug fix, because it's just a different quality of nature. If there's a new feature, there's always new code. And I have to tell to everyone who's doing managing teams, especially the non-developer people, please don't fall into the trap of thinking that only new features are bringing value to the product. Because many features tend to, oh yeah, we need a new feature because then we can sell it to the people. And then we can make a new release and tell like, yeah, there is something new. Because no one, yeah, it's bad marketing. You can't market like, oh, there's a new release, and what we did is we refactored the code and it's more stable and it's more a long-term thing, and refactoring and more tests and so on. Yeah, I know you can sell these things, but these are also part of your code, and refactoring involves lots of changes. So you can't compare these things that are related to amounts of code that is changed. There's also one thing that is totally missing here. What is about removing code? I learned the rule that removing code is a positive thing. When you have a refactoring session and you can remove code, it's not a rule that you have to remove code, but it's a great thing to remove code, because code that is removed is code that you don't have to manage, and that is code that it can't cause any errors anymore. That's great. So don't fall into the trap of new code is good, for example, or new features are good. New features will increase your complexity. You will have to manage that. And in order to manage that complexity, you will need refactoring. And if you see refactoring as a burden, then this will get problematic, maybe not in a year, but maybe in 2 or 3 or 5 years. There will be the day your product gets just a big ball of mud.
Yeah.
So
technical debt is like financial debt. Eventually it will get you.
Yes. So you can't run away from that in the end. And so why I'm showing you this, Meteor had this, I would say Meteor had a little controversial history. And interestingly, if you look at that time where people thought Meteor is dead and so on, there were great commits after Tiny took over, and it looked like, well, there is nothing really happening. There were great commits in the repository, and the community was helping out as well. And it's today the same. And it's not necessarily the same amount as it was in the prime, but it's still great, valuable additions, and even great, valuable removal of things we don't need anymore. Just look at this refactoring. Harry, I think Harry, credits to Harry, yes, removed a lot of these underscore code involvements, because it's we came into the point we don't need it anymore. There are enough natural substitutes in the natural JavaScript ECMA versions. Let's get rid of it. And that's a quality contribution from a long-term view. So just wanted to point out this whole discussion. There is a relation here that we can use MeteorJS as an example. If you want to show someone as an example, there are interesting commits that represent these use cases of small contributions with big impact, big new features, or refactoring with lots of changes. And don't hesitate, if you talk to managers, don't hesitate, get these example out, because sometimes they don't see it. I wouldn't say every manager has bad intentions. I doubt that, not at all. But not everyone is a technical person, and not everyone understands the way things work as we understand them. And it is good to have some, especially when you work with Meteor in a professional manner, it's good to just open a repository and show them these examples. and show how it's related to the overall strategy. Let me explain.
Yes. To finish up on a positive note with this, usually going to leadership, but also in general, besides all that we have kind of said here that Jan and Alan did, there's a nice article from Hacker Noon that kind of tells about, how to transition to being a team leader and still be able to code. Very much recommend to go through it. But here I would say the key things that I'm sometimes trying to practice to more or less success myself. So first of all is to block your time in your calendar so nobody can sneak a meeting in there. That's a very helpful thing to do, especially if you work remotely, but even in office. Do code review with your team. Be there with your team. So with your team, you can still be involved with the code, so you know what's going on and don't get separated from that. Big thing to ask is, what are you responsible for, which is much easier in bigger companies with clear lines of responsibilities, and then stick to that as much as possible, because that will also affect your time. With that, prioritize and delegate. That's what your team is there for. So a lot of times is to delegate issues, and so that you can focus on things that you either like or that are of higher importance that you really have to oversee yourself. Of course, team planning comes all into that, and all these little things that you do with the team, it's part of work time. So utilize that. Big thing is also Pomodoro technique. I actually don't have it installed on this machine. Interesting, but it's a timer where it tells you, okay, you work. Is it, I think, like a? I will mess it up, but it's like 20
minutes.
20 minutes work, 5 minutes pause, 20 minutes work, 5 minutes pause, and after you run through 4 laps, you take 15 minutes off, and that's to keep you focused and also take necessary breaks so that you can stand up. That's actually one of my issues, that I don't stand up enough from the computer, which translates into health problems, which is another things that you should also do, which I don't have here, but keep healthy diet, exercise, especially exercise. It will have positive impact on your thinking. With that, also utilize trackers so that you know how much time you're spending on things, especially I would say in the beginning, as you transition into this, and things can get pretty wild time wise. So make sure that you know what you're spending your times on. And also on the recommendation, interesting there was that outside on your own time, you should work on personal projects, be it hobbies, but personal project in coding, so that you keep yourself sharp. That I think goes back to general keeping your education.
Can I, before we go into the useful resources, quickly show you what GPT told me about the stress level?
You want to share your screen?
Yes, let me share my screen. So actually, I was a bit surprised. I was a bit surprised. Let me increase the font size. So I asked ChatGPT, you're a human resource manager at a software company with 100 employees. Your goal is to improve the overall developer productivity. In your annual survey on developer productivity, you found that the 10 least productive developers reported to be very stressed out. Would you rather terminate their contract in order to focus on the remaining team, or try to relieve the stressed individuals from their stress? Justify your answer. And ChatGPT came up with prioritize addressing the stress of the affected developers rather than terminating their contracts. Then here are the reasons: employee well-being and retention. Stress often results from factors like poor work-life balance, lack of resources, unclear expectations, or team dynamics. Right. Firing employees without addressing underlying issues may signal to the rest of the team that the company is unsupportive, potentially harming retention and employer reputation. cost of turnover, potential for growth, cultural and ethical responsibility. So it looks like ChatGPT was trained with the right material in order to tell the managers. I don't get into the detail right now, but as you can see, it looked like it was trained with the correct material to be long-term sustainability focusing, and but with different material that may have looked like differently, right?
Absolutely. All right, Jan, I know that it's your anniversary and you have to leave. You have to spend some time with your wife. Thank you for joining us today. I know this was your week off, but you came in because this was a topic that we felt we all needed to be part of. So thank you again.
Yeah, thank you for being here. And just paste my last comment. And I will be there next week. So I wish you all a great weekend already, and see you next time.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
And we're still on, even though Jan is not with us. And we have one last item to wrap up with. And it's found this resource. Excuse me. I feel like I need some water or something to clear my throat. Found this resource online. I thought this was actually a really helpful, very useful bit of information, things that I did not know, and I thought I'd share it with you. It didn't quite fit in any of our existing categories. It's really not a utility. I don't even know if we'd call it a tutorial. Let's just call it a tip. And hang on a second, and I need to share my screen this time because I need to do this. So just bear with me for 1 second while I get it up. And there we go. And it's called 9 JavaScript one-liners that replace 50 lines of code. And this is written by Paul. I don't know Paul's last name. It's on Dev 2.0. And, you know, for these, there are 9 items. I just want to show you very quickly 3 of them. How to flatten a nested array. Normally, you would write a function that looks sort of like this, right? You loop over it with a for loop, you get through it. In this case, there is a array function called flat that takes an argument of an array, and then it would actually just create a flattened version of those nested arrays. And I think this is pretty cool. Something that you might want to give a try and see how that might work for you. The other thing that we run into often is cloning objects. And often we get a shallow clone of objects when we just do a creation. If we want to do a deep clone, we've got to do some work. And you may do something that looks like this. You might iterate through the object to get each of its properties, and then make a copy of that onto the new object. But here, if you use the JSON function and stringify the object and then parse it and then assign it back to a new object, you can actually clone that object. So here's an example of a complex object that has a deep nested structure, or so we see that we have like a nested array within the arrays over here. And when we do this, we get a copy of that entire cloned object, which is pretty cool. And the final one I want to show you, by the way, there are others here: string processing, convert to CSV array operations, remove duplicates and sort. And that's the one I want to point out. Is this is an operation that we find ourselves doing quite often. And again, if we're going to go through an array, we're usually going to iterate through it. We're going to check for uniqueness, right? We're going to check for the end of the array, and then, you know, if we find unique things, we'll push them onto our new array, and then we'll sort that array out. In this case, well, not unique. Well, and in this case, we do this one line, and it gives us the same results. We have our unsorted array here of numbers, and we want to just have a uniquely sorted array. So we'll see, like, we have duplicates of 3 in here, and 1 and 5 is mentioned several times. And by just using the function over here that we've defined, we get back just the uniquely sorted list. And same thing here if it's a string array. So these are 3 of the 9. Here's some others: DOM manipulation and query. The reasons I'm not going through these is, they're a little long and they don't visually show up well on the screen here. But I would suggest that you go read this article. Parallel API calls with clean error handling, date-time formatting. This is a really good one. Clean date strings without libraries. So the whole idea is that instead of having to include dependencies, you can do this with just pure JavaScript in a very, very easy way. So I'm sorry that I'm scrolling so fast. Event handling, debouncing with the bloat, right? Object storage with validation. These are really cool tools. So go check out the article. And yeah, that's what I got for you. So let me take that down. And I think we're pretty much at the end here. Are we not? I don't hear you if you're speaking right now.
I was just quickly checking our notes, and as far as I can see, the only thing remaining is for you, Alan, to tell us what's coming up.
Yeah, so next week, we're going to be focusing on the holidays. I mean, we're all probably facing some kind of seasonal holiday, whether it's Christmas, Hanukkah. I don't know what other ones might be here at this point, but usually at the end of the year, there's some kind of seasonal holiday. And people take off, but your responsibilities never really leave you. So if you're on call, what kind of apps would help maintain a stress-free vacation for you? We're going to share with you what we use, and maybe you can share with us the things that you use to make sure that when you're away, you can be away. And with that, I'm going to say, have a great weekend, everybody. Thanks for joining us this week. We'll see you next week.
See you around.
Okay. I got to find a way to stop this thing without